Welcome back to Recap Time. Today, we'll be delving into the action thriller world of The Equalizer, including The Equalizer 2, and The Equalizer 3. Enjoy the recap. The Equalizer is about a guy named Robert McCall who lives in Boston. He spends his days working at the Home Mart hardware store. Robert's just a regular guy leading an everyday life. While at work, he becomes friends with his co-worker, a chubby guy named Ralphie. Ralphie is trying to get in shape for the security officer selection exam. Robert gives Ralphie some advice on eating healthier by suggesting less carbs and more fiber. Robert is a very organized and disciplined person in everything he does. This man has a habit of timing everything he does using the seconds counter on his watch. In the evenings, he goes to a restaurant where he's a regular. He brings his own tea bags and utensils. He's also quite neat and tidy. He carefully arranges his napkins and utensils on the table, making sure everything is clean and in its proper place. The restaurant isn't too crowded that night, and there are only a few customers, including a lovely girl named Elena. Elena greeted Robert and asked about the story in the book he was reading. After a while, Elena said goodbye, called a taxi, and left. The next day, Robert went back to his usual routine. He went to work at Home Mart, had conversations with Ralphie and other coworkers, and then came home to tidy up. He had dinner, and that evening, he went back to his favorite diner with a book. When he arrived there, he noticed Elena entering the diner in revealing attire and lots of makeup. Elena was just about to order a drink when suddenly her cell phone rang, a call from her boss. Elena turns out to be a teenage prostitute who's working under the name Terry for the Russian mob, Slavy. That night, Elena was required to serve a customer who had picked up Elena in front of the diner. Over the phone, Elena tries to get away from her job and persuades Slavy not to have to serve the customer. As it turns out, the man often abuses Elena, but Slavy paid no heed to this and ordered Elena to immediately do her job. Slavy then reminds Elena that the girl owes him and threatens to kill her. Hearing the threat, Elena had no other choice but to obey Slavy's orders. Elena then left the diner and approached the man who had picked her up outside the diner, accompanied by Robert's inquiring glance which was directed at the girl. The next day, Robert was accompanying Ralphie, who was doing physical exercises to lose weight so that he could take the security officer selection exam. Even though Ralphie seemed to have a hard time and almost gave up because of the very heavy training portion, Robert continued to encourage the man and help him with all his heart so that Ralphie could fulfill his desire to become a security guard. Long story short, Robert went back to his usual activities, including visiting his regular restaurant and spending his time there reading books, where that night, Elena was already there first. Elena then walked over to Robert at the corner of her favorite table and asked him for permission before sitting there. Robert allowed Elena to sit and accompany him, after which he noticed bruises on Elena's beautiful face. After chatting for a while, Robert finds out that Elena is forced to work for Slavy because of debt, when in fact, the girl has a dream to become a famous singer. Elena then gave Robert a CD containing a recording of a song sung by her. Robert was very happy to receive the gift and promised the girl that he would listen. After spending time chatting casually at the diner, Robert then decided to take Elena home on foot. Along the way, they had quite an interesting conversation, until finally, a car stopped right in front of them. A man, who was none other than Slavy, got out of the car and went straight to Elena. Slavy then slapped and strangled Elena because the girl had disappointed her customer last night and demanded compensation from Slavy. Seeing this, Robert was about to help Elena, but Slavy then threatened him not to interfere. Slavy then gave a business card to Robert and asked the man to contact him if he needed a comfort woman. After that, Slavy took Elena away from there. In the following nights, Robert no longer saw Elena at his regular diner. One of the employees at the diner told Robert that Elena had been beaten by someone and was currently being treated at the hospital. Hearing this, Robert then went to the hospital and found Elena lying helpless with a face covered in bruises. A girl who is Elena's co-worker named Mandy then tells Robert that Elena has been beaten by Slavy for often rebelling and disobeying Slavy's orders. Seeing Elena's very poor condition and also suffering because she often received harsh treatment from customers and her pimp, Robert then became sorry and decided to help Elena get out of the problems and complicated situations she faced. The scene then switches and shows Slavy entering his fancy restaurant. Slavy then headed to his office, where several of his men had been waiting for the man's arrival to deposit some money from the people who owed Slavy. Not long after, Robert entered Slavy's office and offered the man some money to free Elena so that the girl would no longer have to work for Slavy. But the offer was immediately rejected by Slavy and said that he could make more money if Elena returned to work for him. Since Slavy refused his offer, Robert took the money back and walked towards the door. After being in front of the door, Robert did not immediately leave Slavy's office. The man instead locked the door and turned his body to face Slavy and his henchmen. For a while, Robert made a brief observation of the people in the room, as well as the items in there, where Robert estimated that it would take him only 16 seconds to kill everyone in the room. Slavy and all his henchmen were overthrown by Robert, who slaughtered them with a cold, expressionless face. But it was too late, since Slavy flatly refused Robert's offer at the start of their meeting. After that, Robert went home and went back to his usual activities on the following days. Robert had watched a broadcast on television that reported on the murder of Slavy and his henchmen, where the police concluded that the murder was due to a heated feud between gangs that often occurred. The scene then switches and shows a man named Teddy Ransom, who has just landed in the United States and immediately rushed to the location of Slavy's murder. Slavy's boss, who is sent to investigate Slavy's murder and find the mastermind behind the murder. As a former member of the Russian secret police with special force training, Teddy could easily conclude that the person who had killed Slavy and his henchmen was not a random person, but rather someone who was trained to fight and kill. Meanwhile, Robert is shocked by the news of Ralphie's resignation. When Robert visited Ralphie at his residence, the man seemed to be helping his mother clean up his mother's shop, which was deliberately set on fire by corrupt police officers because her mother refused to give the security allowance. Because of this, Ralphie decided to quit his job at Home Mart and wanted to focus on helping his mother at the store. In the evening, Robert decides to help Ralphie, where the man secretly follows corrupt cops who collect security allowances from small business owners in Ralphie's area. Robert then recorded the actions of the corrupt policemen, then came to them and threatened to distribute the footage if they did not stop their actions. The corrupt cops had fought back, but Robert was stronger. After being beaten by Robert to a pulp, the corrupt policemen returned what they had taken from the residence and no longer carried out the act, because Ralphie's mother had received venture capital to renovate her shop and run her business again. Ralphie finally returned to work at Home Mart and continued his hard training and succeeded in realizing his desire to become a security officer. Elsewhere, Teddy seems to be interrogating gangsters who are often involved in business with Slavy, where Teddy does not hesitate to resort to violence to get the information he needs to find the mastermind behind Slavy's murder. With no results, Teddy then conducts an investigation with the prostitutes who are Slavy's subordinates, where Teddy finally finds out about Alina, who has had problems with Slavy recently. Teddy then goes to Mandy and urges the girl to reveal all the information about Alina and her rebellion to Slavy. Mandy then told Teddy about the black man who had come to visit Alina in the hospital. After that, Teddy kills Mandy. After receiving information from Mandy, Teddy immediately checked the CCTV cameras at the hospital and at the location of Slavy's murder, where Robert's figure was seen there even though it looked dim. One day, Robert is again faced with a situation where he is required to act quickly and incapacitate a man who is trying to rob a Home Mart cashier, who is none other than Robert's co-worker. Because at that time there were many visitors with children, Robert chose to grant the robber's wishes, including the gold ring that the cashier had. Robert let the man off the hook, but clearly remembered the license plate of the car the man was driving. Long story short, the next day, the female cashier was very surprised to find out that her ring, which was robbed yesterday, was suddenly in the cash register, and Robert was seen wiping the big hammer he used last night to knock out the robber and take back the ring. That night, surprisingly, Teddy comes to Robert's house and claims to be a police officer who is investigating the Slavy murder case. Teddy then asks about the whereabouts of Robert, who was in a fancy restaurant on the night of Slavy's murder. Robert, who had been trained to deal with the situation, then calmly answered all the questions asked by Teddy to avoid the man's suspicions. After asking Robert, Teddy said goodbye and left immediately. However, both Teddy and Robert both knew they had lied. Robert can already guess that Teddy is not a policeman, and Teddy concludes that Robert is the mastermind behind Slavy's murder. Knowing that the Russian mafia is now after him, Robert immediately arranges a plan to leave his apartment. Long story short, Teddy orders one of his men to attack Robert at the diner, where Robert can easily knock out Teddy's men. Robert then exits the diner and finds Teddy in his car, where Robert then takes a picture of the man with his cell phone camera. Teddy and his men then chase Robert to his apartment, but they did not find the man there. While searching the apartment, intending to find a clue as to who Robert really is, Teddy finds nothing but drugs and torn sports tickets. On the other hand, Robert turns out to be somewhere else and watching the movements of Teddy and his henchmen through a hidden camera in his apartment. Knowing that he is dealing with one of the largest Russian criminal organizations in the world, Robert decides to visit his old friend and colleague at the Defense Intelligence Agency, Susan Palmer, who uses her resources to give Robert information about Vladimir Pushkin and his operations. Susan also informs Robert that Teddy Renson's real name is Nikolai Yachenko. After giving all the information that Robert wanted, Susan told her husband that Robert didn't ask for help, but he asked for permission to destroy Pushkin's operations in the United States. Robert first goes to Pushkin's cash vault, where Robert can easily incapacitate all of Pushkin's men, lock them all in the refrigerator, and then call the police and leave evidence in the form of a memory stick that loaded with information about Pushkin's illegal activities. In the evening, Teddy is seen having dinner at a fancy restaurant. In front of him appears a man who turns out to be a trained assassin, who was hired by Teddy to kill Robert. However, shortly after the man left Teddy's table, Robert then entered the restaurant and approached Teddy. Robert then sat there, handing Teddy the hitman's cracked and bloodied glasses. Robert then reveals that he already knows about Teddy's past and warns Teddy to stop pursuing him and pledging to bring down Pushkin's criminal enterprise. Later, Robert destroys oil tankers belonging to Pushkin and ultimately destroys Pushkin's entire business in the United States. After that, Teddy immediately set up a plan to immobilize Robert. Teddy and his henchmen go to the Home Mart store and take several of Robert's co-workers as hostages. After that, Robert received a threatening call from Teddy, who wanted him to come to the Home Mart store quickly. Robert was prepared for this situation and managed to sneak into the control room. From there, he used the loudspeaker system to create a distraction, keeping Teddy and his gang occupied. Robert defeated some of Teddy's men and then rescued Ralphie. He asked Ralphie to assist their co-workers in escaping through the back door to safety. Once Robert ensured that Ralphie and their co-workers were out of harm's way, he turned off the main lights in the Home Mart store, leaving only dim spotlights on. Robert took swift action and eliminated Teddy's men one by one using the tools available at the Home Mart store. He ultimately confronted Teddy and ended his life using a nail gun. 3 days later, Robert journeyed to Moscow, where he infiltrated Pushkin's mansion and eliminated all of his guards. Robert used his wit to trick Pushkin into electrocuting himself, putting an end to Pushkin's criminal operations. Upon his return to the United States, Elena, who had recovered from her injuries, approached Robert outside a grocery store. Elena shared that her life had taken a positive turn since breaking free from slavery. She expressed her gratitude to Robert for giving her a fresh start and gave him a gentle kiss on the cheek. The experience with Elena and her colleagues inspired Robert to continue using his abilities to assist those in need. In the evenings, Robert maintained his routine of visiting his favorite diner, but now he brought along not just a book but also a laptop. He used the laptop to post an online advertisement, now identifying himself as the Equalizer. The movie's moral is that, irrespective of our past or background, we hold the power to shape the kind of person we want to become in the future. Robert, utilizing his skills, chose to aid those in his community and help them overcome their challenges, driven solely by his sense of humanity and care for others. The second movie begins with a picturesque train journey to Istanbul. Inside one of the compartments, there's a man who looks like a local Muslim, complete with a long beard and a cap. He appears to be engrossed in a book, but his real focus is on a family of 3, a father, a mother, and their young daughter. This man, disguised as a Muslim, is actually Robert McCall, undercover and keeping a watchful eye. When the father gets up to go to the dining car, McCall does the same and strikes up a conversation with him. When asked about his purpose in Turkey, McCall reveals that he's searching for a Turkish man who married an American woman, had a daughter with her, and then mistreated and took the daughter back to Turkey. It becomes clear that McCall is talking about the man in question, and the man slowly stands up. After leaving the dining car, the Turkish man signals his buddies to deal with Robert. What they don't know is that they're about to mess with a highly skilled vigilante. Robert easily takes down these attackers, leaving them all sprawled on the train floor. Once he's dealt with them, Robert calmly returns to the Turkish man. He offers the man a choice, either face the usual pain or endure something much worse. The scene changes from the tense train to the busy city streets. Here, we see Robert working as a Lyft driver, driving a cool black car. He stops to pick up Sam, an elderly man with a complicated case of finding his long-lost sister. While driving, Robert often chats with his passengers, observing some while having conversations with others. His life might seem ordinary now, but it's anything but. Grace, the mother of the young girl Robert rescued on the train, visits her lawyer's office. There, she's met with the beautiful sight of her daughter, safe and sound. The mother and daughter embrace each other, filled with relief and tears. Robert's intervention made all of this possible, and their gratitude knows no bounds. However, Robert remains on the road, quietly observing, ready for the next passenger, and whatever life throws at him. Suddenly, the scene shifts to a home in Brussels. A man named Calbert enters, taking off his coat, expecting an ordinary evening at home. However, the sight that greets him in his dining room is anything but ordinary. His wife, face marred with bruises and blood, is seated at the dining table, crying. Before Calbert can comprehend the situation, a man coldly shoots his wife right before his eyes. The men then force Calbert to hold a gun and face it to himself. A moment later, a gunshot rings out. The narrative abruptly switches back to Robert, unfazed, continuing his job as a Lyft driver. He pulls up to collect his next fare, a man assisting a visibly distressed woman into the cab. She appears to be in severe pain, but Robert remains silent. Later, Robert arrives at the man's apartment, informing him that he'd taken the woman to the hospital, where they'd discovered multiple injuries on her. He advises them to do the right thing and attend to her, but the man attempts to attack him. With swift precision, Robert uses the man's card to slash him, subsequently breaking his and his buddy's bones in a swift, brutal showdown that lasts no more than 30 seconds. It becomes clear that Robert is not an ordinary man. His combat skills and ruthless efficiency show him to be extraordinarily dangerous, a skill he learned from his previous life. When Robert returns home, he's pleasantly surprised to find his old friend Susan waiting for him. They reconnect over dinner, during which Susan reveals that she's working on a high-profile murder case involving a couple in Brussels. Her partner on the case is a man named Dave. In the midst of their conversation, Susan gently reminds Robert that it's his late wife's birthday, a fact he'd forgotten. Concerned for his well-being, she suggests he make an effort to socialize more and possibly find a new companion. The following day, Robert discovers that Fatima's garden and wall have been vandalized. As he begins cleaning up the mess, a young man named Miles Whittaker approaches, suggesting that it's the landlord's job, not Robert's. After some negotiation, Miles agrees to repaint the vandalized wall for $350. Elsewhere, Susan engages in an online chat with Dave. They discuss the Brussels murder case and the puzzling fact that the victims were actually their fellow agents. In a bid to distract himself, Robert spends some time with Sam, a Lyft passenger who confides in him about being separated from his sister during the World Wars when he was just 9 years old. A treasured photograph confirms her identity. It's the same face immortalized in a portrait. Meanwhile, Susan and Dave arrive in Brussels to investigate the scene. As there is no evidence pointing towards a homicide, the case has been officially classified as the husband losing his mind and taking both their lives. Susan is visibly disturbed by the blood spattered on family photos. After thoroughly examining the crime scene, they depart. Susan and Dave head back to their hotel, discussing the mysterious circumstances surrounding the deaths of their colleagues. In the elevator, Susan bids Dave goodbye, reminding him to pick up some chocolate before they leave the country. As Susan enters her hotel room, she is ambushed by two men. Despite her valiant attempts to fend them off and managing to injure one, they overpower her, pinning her in the bedroom. Meanwhile, back home, Robert is spending time with Miles, imparting life advice. His peaceful moment is interrupted by a phone call from Brian, Susan's husband. His smile fades instantly, replaced by anger. Without a word, he abruptly ends his conversation with Miles and walks away. He immediately travels to Washington, D.C., to attend Susan's funeral, offering his condolences to Brian. He promises to bring the perpetrators to justice. Ryan informs Robert that Susan never carried jewelry, implying her attack was not a random act of violence. Intrigued by this information, Robert decides to investigate Susan's murder himself. Using his skills, he decrypts Susan's phone to identify who she was communicating with before her death. He also hacks into the hotel's security system, gaining access to the surveillance footage, studying the crime scene photos and replaying the elevator footage repeatedly. He senses that something is off, sparking his intuition to unravel the mystery surrounding Susan's death. In another part of town, the two assailants who killed Susan are indulging in some leisure time. However, their revelry is short-lived as a cell phone rings. Upon answering the call, a bomb detonates, decimating their apartment. The orchestrator turns out to be one of the three men responsible for the cold-blooded murder in Belgium. Simultaneously, Robert reunites with his former partner, Dave. Dave is visibly shocked to see Robert alive, revealing that he had attended what he believed to be Robert's funeral. He expresses disappointment that Robert, despite their 6-year-long partnership, hadn't told him he was alive. Robert, ignoring Dave's reproach, informs him about his suspicion that Susan's murder was a premeditated act. pointing out the peculiar fact that she hadn't pressed her elevator button. Seeking answers, Robert delves into Susan's last case, suspecting it could provide insights into her murder. He mentally reconstructs the crime scene, visualizing himself present at the site. His sharp, analytical mind starts piecing together potential scenarios, attempting to unravel the sequence of events that led to Susan's demise. He contacts Dave and goes over the facts of Susan's murder and the Belgian couple's murder. Robert spots a common thread: both the crimes were perpetrated by a left-handed individual. This connection leads Robert to believe that the same person is responsible for both the acts and that there is a bigger, more complex picture to consider. As he ends the call, we see his apartment as a testament to his tireless pursuit of the truth, papers, and technology dedicated to investigating Susan's murder strewn all around. He then looks outside to see the wall half done and Miles nowhere to be found. He grabs his gun and leaves. He enters hood territory and immediately knocks out the guard and takes his pistol. Upstairs, he quickly takes out 2 men, and then we see Miles hanging out with a gang. They give him a gun and tell him don't come back until the clip is empty. Robert shows them a proper gangster's behavior, and with dual-wield guns, he tells Miles to go. Downstairs, Miles goes off at him, but Robert tells him if he's so eager to be a gangster, let's jumpstart his career, putting a gun to his own head as Miles holds it. He buckles. Then Robert takes the gun back and gives him a mad lecture that his boys are merely just boys, nothing more. He tells him to decide his choice and leaves. He returns home until he hears a knock. He opens to find Miles there, telling him that he finished painting the wall. They talk for a bit until Miles says he can repaint his house wall, but Robert tells him he'll agree to it if he reads a book he hands him. Robert returns to his day job as a Lyft driver, picking up a seemingly ordinary passenger. The man is heading to the airport to catch a flight overseas to visit his daughter. However, as the journey progresses, Robert becomes suspicious of the passenger's odd behavior. His instincts prove right when the man suddenly brandishes a knife and lunges at Robert. Robert violently swerves the car, throwing the attacker off balance and stopping his attempts to stab him. Amidst the chaos, Robert manages to break his arm, forcing the man to pull a gun out. Robert is quicker, disarming him and ultimately killing him. To eliminate any evidence linking him to the passenger's death, Robert retrieves the man's phone and sets his car on fire with the remains inside the car. The following morning, Robert heads to Dave's house. Inside, he's introduced to Dave's wife and their 2 young girls. As the family heads off to start their day, Robert seizes the opportunity to share the unsettling events from his previous day with Dave. Robert sets the assassin's mobile phone he'd obtained and places it onto the table. He dials a certain number, and to their surprise, Dave's own cell starts to ring, unveiling him as the orchestrator behind the string of murders. Dave ends up confessing to his crimes. He rationalizes his actions by claiming he had turned into a mercenary after feeling betrayed by the government. The murder of Susan was a necessary evil, he argues, as she would have eventually unraveled his involvement in the Belgium murders. Following the revelation, Dave escorts Robert outdoors, introducing him to Resnick, Ari, and Kovac, the trio performing the killings under Dave's directive. In a bitter twist of irony, these are the very men whom Robert had trained while they were all in the CIA. Robert tells them that their mistake was killing Susan, and now each one of them will taste death. He promises that he will have his revenge for what they did to her, and then he tells Dave's wife that Dave said she can drop him off at the station. He adopts a playful gun hand gesture, picking up Dave's daughter in his arms, which makes him burn inside. One day, Dave and his 3 companions head to Brian's house with the intention of harming him. However, their plan is foiled when they discover the house is empty. Anticipating their move, Robert had previously taken Brian to a safe location. Frustrated by their failed mission, the men change their course and head to Robert's house. Meanwhile, Miles is busy painting the interior of the house. Sensing danger, he quickly contacts Robert. Robert promptly accesses his surveillance camera feed and instructs Miles to hide in a secret compartment. From behind a 2-way mirror, Miles anxiously watches Dave. Dave becomes suspicious of the mirror and is about to shoot at it when his phone rings. On the other end of the line, Robert claims to be at a location known to both of them. Thinking they've been led away, a relieved Miles comes out of hiding. However, his feeling of safety is short-lived as he finds himself cornered and at gunpoint by Dave's men. The story then shifts to Robert heading to a small town where he used to live with his wife. This town is being evacuated due to an approaching storm and hurricane. Despite the danger, Dave and his group arrive and forcefully enter the town, even killing an officer in the process. They search Robert's former home thoroughly but find no sign of him. Their search of the surrounding area also proves futile. Opting for an elevated vantage point, Dave stations himself on a tower to oversee his 3 colleagues as they spread out to locate Robert. Robert, however, outmatches his adversaries with his extensive experience and skills. He cleverly sets traps that his pursuers stumble into without realizing. Kovac, who enters a shop, thinking he's found Robert, is swiftly killed when a harpoon pierces through him. Ari tries to follow but is met by Robert, who skillfully slashes him, causing severe harm. Finally, Risnik, pursuing Robert into another store, meets his end due to an explosive trap. Meanwhile, Dave, perched on a tower with a sniper rifle, connects with Robert over the phone. He threatens to harm Miles, whom he has locked in a car trunk, unless Robert surrenders. Despite warning shots from Dave, Robert remains elusive. Just as Dave aims for the car holding Miles, Robert shoots the car's tire, causing Dave's shot to miss. In a frantic attempt to find Robert, Dave is taken by surprise as he discovers Robert already on the tower, leading to a face-off. Dave tries to stab Robert, but Robert's agility outmatches him, causing him to miss. Amid the violent backdrop of the looming hurricane, Robert retaliates by gouging out Dave's eye, grabbing his knife to impale him, and then finally slicing him from behind, killing him. Robert concludes by hurling Dave off the tower, where he meets his end against the jagged rocks below, and is subsequently swept away by the violent ocean waves. Robert swiftly moves to locate Miles, finding the young man trembling in agony from a gunshot wound to his leg. Robert transports the wounded Miles to his old home for first aid. Amidst tending to Miles, Robert finds himself gazing at a framed picture of his deceased wife Vivian. As the film nears its conclusion, we observe Miles on a bus en route to art school. Fatima, Robert's neighbor, discovers the mural on the wall that uncannily mirrors a scene from her homeland. An inscription on the opposing wall reads, "I leave you with the best of myself." The narrative unfolds to reveal Sam being reunited with his sister Magda. Robert had intervened, leveraging some strings to bring them back together. In the last scene, we observe Robert in his former home, deep in thought as he looks out at the peaceful sea, signifying the conclusion of this eventful journey. The final movie of Equalizer begins. The opening scene features a crime enforcer named Lorenzo Vidal, who is driving towards his secluded winery in Sicily with his grandson. Once there, he asks his grandson to stay in the vehicle while he cautiously ventures inside. To his horror, he discovers that many of his henchmen have been brutally killed. As he walks into the basement, he finds a retired U.S. Marine and DIA operative named Robert McCall, who is being held at gunpoint by 2 of Lorenzo's bodyguards. The latter asks for the reason why he is here, to which Robert responds that Lorenzo possesses something that he shouldn't have. After a brief exchange, Robert kills the rest of the henchmen, as well as Lorenzo, and the way he does it is nuts too. He punches his gun through a guy's face. I don't think that's possible. As he walks out of the winery, he notices Lorenzo's grandson in the vehicle, and instructs the boy to stay put without moving. However, as he walks up to his car, the boy shoots Robert in the back and makes a quick escape. Despite the injury, Robert manages to board a ferry to go back to the mainland. Later that night, while driving on the Amalfi Coast, Robert pulls over and slips into unconsciousness due to the gunshot. After a while, a local carabiniere named Gio Benucci finds him in this state and decides to help him. He brings him to a remote coastal Italian town in Altamont, where a doctor named Enzo treats him. Upon regaining consciousness, Enzo informs Robert that Gio saved him. He also inquires whether Gio rescued a good or bad man, but Robert doesn't know how to respond. When he attempts to return home, Enzo intervenes, insisting that his wound requires time to heal and offers him a place to stay. Enzo takes care of Robert, and after 3 days of treatment, the latter begins to walk with the help of a cane. One day, he ventures outside to explore the town, hiding himself from the cops around the streets. He eventually ends up at a local cafe where he meets an owner and waitress named Amina. She serves him their best coffee, despite him having ordered a tea. You got him right. Shortly after, Gio comes to the cafe on his regular visit with his daughter Gabby and meets Robert. While Amina entertains his daughter, Gio hands over Robert's car keys and clears that he hasn't checked his bags yet. Gio also mentions that he has parked Robert's car behind the station and can retrieve it whenever he feels better. In the next scene, Robert makes an anonymous call to the CIA Financial Operations Group and speaks to an agent named Emma Collins. He tips her off about the winery in Sicily and how it has been connected to the illegal drug trade disguised as normal business transactions. After conveying this information, he renders the phone dysfunctional. On the other hand, Emma relays the information with other CIA operatives. Robert spends the next few days wandering around the town and eventually gets acquainted with the locals there. In the midst of this, he also learns about Camorra, an Italian mafia gang, who harasses and threatens the town people over their earnings, demanding regular payments. In other words, they're bad guys, and Robert is a good guy. That's all you really need to know. One day, Robert notices a local seafood vendor named Angelo getting beaten up by a high-ranking Camorra member named Marco Quaranta. Before leaving, he threatens Angelo that he will come back next week to collect the money. Following this, the gangsters head to a large building where the leader of the Co., who is also Marco's brother, Vincent Quaranta, is trying to forcefully evacuate the premises. It turns out that Camorra is working on their grand plan, commercializing the town by building new hotels, resorts, and casinos. In one of the building rooms, an elderly man in a wheelchair refuses to comply with the gang. As a result, the gang members hang the old man from the window, leaving him to die. Just in case you didn't know, they were the bad guys yet. On the other hand, Robert and Enzo share a pleasant dinner conversation, and Robert insists on helping him with his daily errands. The following morning, he goes to the market on behalf of Enzo and visits Angela's shop. The kind-hearted Angela refuses to accept payment for the groceries, stating that it's his honor that Enzo's friend has come over to his shop for the first time. Meanwhile, Emma and other CIA operatives, acting on Robert's tip-off, arrive at the winery to conduct their investigation. There, they uncover millions in cash, along with bags full of illegal narcotics hidden in a storeroom. Surprised that these activities were off their radar, Emma and her colleague Frank Conroy decide to go into the depth of the matter on a rainy day. Enzo is examining Robert's wound when the latter asks him for the reason why he treated him without involving any ambulance or police. In response, Enzo reminds him of his first question that he asked about being a good or bad person and how he had no answers to it. He claims that his silence was indeed the sign of a good person. The next evening, Robert retrieves his backpacks and prepares to leave the town, but he is stopped by the sound of a bell. Just then he notices the town people rushing towards Angelo's shop, prompting him to follow them. It turns out that Marco and his gang have burnt down Angelo's shop due to his inability to make payment. Despite this dominance, the town people can do nothing but watch helplessly. Later, Robert, along with some townspeople, help Angelo to clean up the mess. Meanwhile, Gio reviews footage of the firebombing and calls the Italian Central Police for an inquiry about a van that was seen outside Angelo's shop. In the midst of this, Robert is gradually recovering, becoming a part of the local community, and deepening his friendship with Amina. He also explores more of the local cuisine of Altamont, eventually adapting to the town. As a result of all this, the Camorra interfering and bringing their influence into Altamont troubles him far more than he had expected. On one routine day, Robert is seen enjoying his coffee at Amina's cafe when he spots Emma secretly trying to take his photo. Robert then confronts her, suggesting that she capture the photo from a better angle. Emma asks why and how he has such precise information about the winery's real business. However, he sticks to giving her some vague answers, also advising her to delve into her remaining work. As she leaves, she addresses him by his name, which surprises him. Later that day, Gio goes to pick up his daughter from school. During this time, he receives a call from an unknown number informing him that Gabby's school was over a bit earlier than the other kids. Concerned, Gio inquires to one of the teachers, who reveals that an officer had picked Gabby up just a while back. In a state of panic, he rushes home, only to find his wife and daughter held captive by the Komodo gang. Marco then beats him up in front of his family, punishing him for interfering in their operations. The gang threatens to take the life of his family if he interferes again. In the evening, Robert notices Gio leaving Enzo's office with blood patches on his face. Curious, he asks about the matter, and Enzo explains that such incidents are common in many towns due to the Camorra. According to Enzo, the issue is like cancer with no cure. So, just like cancer, the next day, Robert goes to the church where he meets Emma one more time. She confirms that Lorenzo Vidal had been on Interpol's most wanted list for a decade, and that his operation was quite huge in itself. Intrigued about why he chose her for the anonymous tip, Emma questions his intentions. However, he diverts the subject by stating that she should be focusing on why Sicily was being targeted for these smuggling activities. Promising to find the answer soon, Emma says that she hopes to know the answer to her original question in their next meeting. That evening, Gio and his family are having dinner at a restaurant. When Marco and his peers interrupt their quality time, Marco demands that Gio help them set up a boat for their private business purpose. Robert, who is also in the same restaurant, overhears their conversation and requests that they leave the family alone. In response, Marco threatens him to stay away from matters that don't concern him. In a calm tone, Robert expresses his growing fondness for this town and its people. He then urges Marco to take his business elsewhere and warns him of the consequences if he doesn't comply. When Marco still ignores the warning, Robert twists his shoulder and locks up his hand, making him scream. He says, "I'm pressing on your hibbity-tibbity nerve. The pain is gonna get real bad." He then orders Marco to leave his gun on the table and exit the restaurant with his men. After a while, the enraged Marco plans to go back in with his henchmen and kill Robert. But before they can go forward with their plan, Robert drives a van through two of his henchmen and starts fighting them. At one point, Marco holds him at knife point and threatens to take his life. Regardless, Robert retaliates by twisting Marco's hand and drives the knife through his neck, ultimately killing him. And he didn't even have to grab his hibbity-bibbity nerve. The following morning, Frank contacts Emma from Rome to let her know about the latest station bombing. It's revealed that the cash found earlier in the winery was also linked to a similar terrorist act. This makes Emma realize that the Camorra is directly funding terrorism by paying for smuggling drugs into Sicily. Furthermore, she speculates that Naples serves as the primary transit point for drug transpo, and suspects the involvement of another team in Naples. Determined to unravel the entire story, higher chain, she begins her investigation by interviewing key members of the Camorra. For this, she also requests partnership and access with the head of Naples police. Later on, we see the same police chief attending the funeral of Marco at Vincent's mansion. During this, he informs Vincent about the involvement of CIA officer Emma, who is investigating their illicit trades. Vincent, who is mourning his brother's death, becomes enraged by the statement and slices off the chief's hand. He then threatens the chief to focus on finding out the person behind Marco's death. After this, Vincent sends the police chief to the hospital, with his severed hand preserved in an ice bucket. Elsewhere, Emma receives a call informing her about the police chief's predicament. Shortly after, she also gets a call from Robert, who tells her about the Camorra's involvement in the drug cartel, closely tied to the earlier station attack. Robert's call inadvertently saves Emma's life, preventing her from falling victim to Vincent's planned bomb attack on her car. In the aftermath, Emma is immediately rushed to the hospital for med assistance. There she meets Frank and alerts him about the Camorra. Upon learning everything, Frank assures her that he will handle the remaining operation. That evening, Vincent takes Gio and his family as hostages and threatens to shoot them in front of the entire town if his brother's murderer doesn't show up. When Vincent doesn't receive any information, he shoots Gio's ear and threatens to end him with the next shot. Just then, Robert reveals himself to Vincent and asks him to let the captives go. He claims that he's ready to be taken away and tortured, but not in front of the townspeople. However, Vincent, who is as arrogant as his brother, refuses, asserting that the locals must witness the consequences against the Camorra. But before Vincent can kill him, the townspeople start recording the ordeal, causing the gangsters to retreat the same night. Robert infiltrates Vincent's home and stealthily kills his bodyguards one by one. Vincent, who is asleep, is startled by a drop of blood on his forehead. The glass right above him suddenly shatters, but he narrowly manages to escape. He then grabs his gun and tries to contact his already deceased gang members. Shortly after, Robert approaches him and forces him to take a lethal dose of his own drugs. Vincent tries to run away from his mansion, but Robert follows him. Eventually, the gangster collapses on the cobbled road of Naples and ultimately succumbs to drug overdose. The next morning, Robert pays a visit to Emma at the hospital, who expresses her gratitude for saving her life. He drops a bag of cash on the floor and shares the story of a man named Greg Dyer, who had lost his pension in a cyber attack. This makes her realize that Robert had followed the trail of the attack to the winery, killed Lorenzo and his henchmen, and retrieved the exact cash that was owed to Greg. Curious, she asks if Robert and Dyer are friends, to which he clarifies that they have only met once. In the next scene, Emma goes to Boston in order to deliver the lifetime earnings to Greg and his wife. Greg asks about the identity of the generous benefactor and wonders why someone would go to such lengths for a stranger. However, Emma replies that she would love to know the reason as well. After she departs, Greg happily asks his wife to unpack everything because they don't have to sacrifice their house anymore. One day, at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, Frank hands Emma a package containing a diary and a note from Robert. Much to her surprise, it's her mother's diary. As she connects the dots, she learns that Robert is none other than a friend of her parents from the CIA. In the final scene, the residents of Altamont are seen celebrating their victory in a football match. Robert also participates in the celebration with some borderline cringe but still badass dance moves as one of the locals. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.